Okay, okay, all right. Uh, Great. Okay, well, welcome to this three-part class that I am really excited to share with you all, because this is all the stuff that why I became a rabbi, was to teach this stuff. It wasn't to to go to executive committee meetings, as much as I love that, and that's an essential part of what we do and so forth. But this is really what why I went down this path. So it's very meaningful and gratifying to be able to teach this. So tonight I'm gonna do kind of an intro talk, focusing on the two main initial personalities of Hasidism, or I'm gonna often say Hasidut is the word in Hebrew for Hasidism, and we'll hopefully get to some text tonight, and please feel free to interrupt me here and there, just raise your hand, or physically or Zoom wise, or just unmute. So to start, because we are going to be, this is only 3 sessions, they're not overly long, so we're just going to be scratching the surface, but in addition to learning text, we're going to try and be doing a little bit of spiritual practice here and there. So, one of the core Hasidic spiritual practices is nigunim, is songs, often without words, but sometimes with words. And so I think we should get in a good niggin to begin, and. So I don't think most of you, I'm sure, won't know it, but it's pretty simple. And so the important thing to remember with, this is different from like the nigun, when we're kind of like just gathering, to start services or something. So you want to, to sing a nigun as a spiritual practice, you want to first, just center yourself. Just kind of ground yourself in your body and make sure you're present. And then you really want to let go as much as possible of kind of the analyzer, commenting quality voice that's in each of our heads. Depending on our wiring, it's turned up more loudly or less loudly. So just like let that go, the commenter, the analyzer, just it'll rear its voice, but just let it be like a cloud kind of passing through the sky. And you want to really just like throw your once you get the melody, like really throw the fullness of your being into singing it, throw your heart into it. If you're able to, if it's meaningful for you, if it feels okay to make it like a little devotional, to like imagine you're kind of, it's really it's a prayer. It's, you're singing to God. If that feels right, please, that'll definitely enhance the experience. That's a good basic intro nigun.
Do you want us to be muted, or do you want us to unmute and sing together?
Yeah, I think you'll have to be muted, unfortunately. I don't think Zoom won't really work for us to sing together, but one day, at the next pandemic. We'll be able to all sing together. There'll be no Zoom delay. So I don't actually know where this nigun comes from. I have to ask the person I learned it from where it comes from, but I didn't get to do that. But it is Hasidic. So it goes like this. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. We'll do that again. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. We'll do the whole thing. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. It's a good one to raise one's energy a little bit. It has a nice joyous quality. Okay, we'll re-welcome everyone. A couple other folks joined us. So this class is really about certain, curated elements of early Hasidism that I feel that have been important to me, that I also think are important to early Hasidism. I'll explain a little bit more about that. It's not a whole overview of Hasidism from its beginnings in the mid 1700s to now or anything like that. And it's not very historically oriented. It's not about what people in Borough Park or Mea Sharim in Israel do now. I've only dipped my toe in a little bit here and there to into contemporary, like traditional Hasidic communities. It's more about what we could call neo-Hasidism, so which is actually a kind of historical development, which I'll say a little bit more about later as well. But it's Hasidic, but we're not trying to Hasidism as a system of meaning and practice and even as a way of understanding Jewish spirituality. So to begin, we have to talk about the Baal Shem Tov, who's conventionally called the founder of Hasidism. He didn't know he was founding a movement. He probably never intended to found a movement. He was just kind of doing his thing. And so he lived 1700 to 1760, roughly, in what's now mostly in what's now Ukraine. The borders, in that time were changing a lot, and it's very confusing to, there's like 3 partitions of Poland that happened in like the early Hasidic movement. So, things changed a lot, but it was mostly Ukraine. And for a while, there were some scholars, because Baal Shem Tov became such a legendary figure, and some scholars even wondered if he really existed, because he seemed to be like larger than life. Was he even a real person? And once the Soviet Union fell, or the Iron Curtain fell, and scholars could access the records in archives, they began to do that, and they found that, yes, there was this guy, Eliezer, I don't know if he was known in the records as Eliezer Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov means master of the good name. That he was able, meaning the divine name, that he was one of, there were a number of people who were what were called Balei Shem, who could use, usually this was in the context of writing amulets often for the sake of healing or protection. So different ways of writing divine names. I wasn't trained on any of this in rabbinical school, nor have I studied up on it. But he is there in the Polish tax records. It even says he was a Kabbalista. He's like listed in the records there. It says he was given a house by the community of, he lived in a town called Mezhebuj, which is not an easy town to say. I think it is still inhabited by Ukrainian folks. We know that he had his own minyan. This became kind of this was a feature of early Hasidism for a lot of the early figures to kind of not pray in a big synagogue, but to just pray among kind of the people they wanted to pray with. Basically, they kind of got to choose, the guys that they wanted to be with to kind of do their, oftentimes it was their disciples, but Baal Shem Tov's disciples didn't necessarily live, I'm sure many of them didn't live in Mezhebuj. So he was, being a Baal Shem and being how he was, more so than say his successor, the Maggid of Mezrich, Dov Ber of Mezrich, he really was this kind of healer figure. We have stories about him having a basic knowledge of herbs, of herbalism, that he probably learned from other peasants. We know he spent a lot of time in the woods. He lived in like semi-retreat for a number of years in the Carpathian Mountains before he kind of began to teach publicly. I think he ran an inn, or probably more his wife ran the inn, and he's off digging clay, or we don't know exactly. We have different things in some of the stories. But he had a lot of time to do contemplative practice. He was not like going to, having a traditional kind of rabbinic, going to yeshiva, learning a lot of Talmud. He seems to have had, some basic learning in Talmud, but he was not a particularly learned person. What attracted people to him was that he seems to have been a really extremely powerful personality, and how he could teach, give over texts. So there's stories about like how the Maggid of Mezrich became his student. He came to visit the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov gave the Maggid like a text from the Zohar, the great medieval Kabbalistic text that has a lot of authority in Jewish mysticism. And the Maggid, explained it in a fine way, but then kind of gave it back to the Baal Shem Tov. And then, the Maggid says, like, the Baal Shem Tov began to explain it, and there was like fires and lights and, all kinds of amazing stuff, fireworks going off. And so it just, clearly came alive in a way that had not been experienced before. Some other really interesting things about him is that he didn't really have a teacher. At least he didn't have a teacher in this world that he talks about. He talks about having kind of a spirit teacher who was this kind of little known figure from the Tanakh called Achia Hashiloni. He's mentioned in the Tanakh, I forget around like which king or something like that. But that he received guidance from this figure who was not living at the same time as him. We have other stories of like him asking dream questions, like that he would have a difficult question about something with with God and spirituality, and he would ask a question before going to bed, and he would get an answer in a dream. Or he even says, like in one text I have, like that he learned, like his neshama taught him, his soul taught him the answer to something. So and he has more so than most, I think, all of the other Hasidic figures. He has what I would call like a shamanic quality. Partly that comes from his nature connection and like his healing orientation, but he was someone who would traverse spiritual worlds. That was kind of that was a big part of his spirituality. That was a big part of his spiritual power. And so I'm going to tell you a short story. It's one of my favorite stories about Baal Shem Tov. So this comes it's a story told about his brother-in-law, and who was not, I don't know if he wrote some. He didn't really become famous, but he is mentioned a bunch in the Baal Shem Tov, in Baal Shem Tov stories. He's named Gershon Kutover, and there's a whole genre of Gershon Kutover stories, like with the Baal Shem Tov. And so he was a Baal Shem Tov's brother-in-law, and what's important to know is Reb Gershon was really well educated, classically rabbinic educated, and also a Kabbalist. And he was kind of representative of like this more rabbinic Kabbalistic elite of that time. And he also had his own, like, it was called a klois in Yiddish. I don't know which is like his own minyan that he would pray with in the town of Brody. And there's stories about how when his sister was marrying the Baal Shem Tov, he thought she was marrying this kind of uncouth ignoramus and so forth. And he was not very excited, but he eventually came around and became not exactly like partly a student, but also kind of like you would say in Hebrew, like a Talmid Chaver, like a student, but also a colleague of the Baal Shem Tov. So this story takes place a few years before the Baal Shem Tov died, and Reb Gershon went to visit the Baal Shem Tov and stay with him over Shabbos. And so they're davening Kabbalat Shabbat, praying together. I don't know if they were in a shul, or probably they were in shul, but they might have just been by themselves because there's no one else in the story, the way I've seen it. And so the Reb Gershon finishes his davening, and the Baal Shem Tov's still going. He's still doing his Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, the standing prayer, and the Baal Shem Tov just keeps going. And Reb Gershon, he doesn't want to waste his time, so he does the traditional practice of reading the Torah portion twice in Hebrew and once in Aramaic, and he does that, and Baal Shem Tov's still going, and he knew they're not going to eat dinner until after the Baal Shem Tov finishes, so he actually asked some people to bring him some pillows so he could take a nap, and so he goes and he takes a nap, and eventually they finish and they're having dinner, and Reb Gershon asked Baal Shem Tov, why were you davening for so long? What was going on? I also use these special kavanot, these special intentions from Isaac Luria, the great earlier mystic, who had these special, very complicated kind of prayer meditations that more mystically minded people would use. Reb Gershon's like, I used those too, and I still finished like way before you. What was going on? And you made all these like intense movements. What were you doing? And the Baal Shem Tov just kind of is like, oh, don't worry about it. He just kind of laughed him off. He didn't answer, and so Reb Gershon, he didn't want to give up. He asked him a second time. He's really pushing him, and he says, what were you doing? Please tell me. So Baal Shem Tov says, listen, when I come to the words, the second bracha in the Amidah, in the Shemona Esrei, where it talks about God reviving the dead, Michayei HaMeitim, right? We don't have this this was actually the topic of last week's class, about how part of the topic, how we change this blessing in Reconstructionism, where we say Michayei Kol Chai, but the traditional text is Michayei Meitim, that God revives the dead in the second bracha. The Baal Shem Tov says, when I get there, I practice these certain intentions. They're called unifications or yichudim, and I see thousands of dead souls that come to me, and I have to speak to each one of them and find out why they haven't been permitted to reach their heavenly resting place. And then I make a tikkun, I make a little healing, and I pray for their elevation so that they can be healed and that they can, get to where they need to go in the whole cycle of souls. And, I have to deal with them in order of importance. I have to rank it a little bit, because if I just dealt with them all, I'd be here for like 3 years. But, eventually I hear a heavenly proclamation, and they let me know that I'm done, and I don't continue, and so then I finish and I step back and I conclude. Reb Gershon's like, oh, well, why don't these souls come to me, huh? And so the Baal Shem Tov says, okay, stay with me another Shabbos, and I'll write down for you these kavanot, and you can see what happens. So he did that. It's next Erev Shabbat, and Baal Shem, they come to the place for davening the Amidah, and Reb Gershon gets up to daven, and then the Baal Shem Tov actually, he decides to wait, because he knew that Reb Gershon was going to have a difficult time, so he didn't want to be all ensconced in his davening. So so Reb Gershon's davening, and the story says that Baal Shem Tov's adjusting his watch and kind of sniffing tobacco, and he's kind of waiting for things to progress. And so he sees this indeed happens to Reb Gershon. He sees all these souls, and he feels faint, and he actually collapses. And the Baal Shem Tov helps him up. He revives, but he sends him home to rest and recover a little bit. A little while later, Reb Gershon's okay, and they come back, and they're at the Shabbos table, and the Baal Shem Tov asks him. He says, "What happened? Why did you feel faint?" And he says, "Well, when I meditated the way you did, I had all of these dead souls coming to me, and like a great flock of sheep, and it was just so much." And the Baal Shem Tov says jokingly, give this guy a potch, like give him a little like nudge, so he's not going to make fun of the Baal Shem Tov again, and push him to reveal his secrets. So that's the story. So I see, there are some other Rebbes who had, different kinds of these sorts of similar-ish capacities, but I think it's an important thing. This is not what we're going to be focusing on. We're not going to be doing soul ascents in the class. It's not. I haven't made that part of my rabbinic experience yet. But I think it's important to know that this is there in the tradition, and especially as now, shamanism is very much part of the broader spiritual scene, and so this kind of stuff is part of our tradition too. And some of us, this may be totally out there. For some of us, this is certainly not like classical Reconstructionism in any way, but obviously for others of us, we may know people who have, either have certain experiences that are not entirely dissimilar from this, or, or certainly folks in other cultures, regularly have experiences like that. And
could I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's probably just something I don't understand. So my understanding is that it's against Jewish law to try to contact the dead. And how does that relate to this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't think I don't know how they understood it, but how they understood. In short, I don't really know how they understood that. That kind of traditional prohibition, but there's a lot of different stories about other Rebbes doing this. Reb Nachman is as well, and it's an interesting question. I don't really know. Clearly he must have understood it in some different way where it didn't, where it wasn't seen in that, as violating that principle. I'm just going to put into the chat for people who are, if anyone is interested in in Jewish shamanism, I have the book for you. There's a really interesting book called Magic of the Ordinary by Rabbi Gershon Winkler, Recovering the Shamanic in Judaism. And he was originally an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, left ultra-Orthodoxy, but he brings all kinds of really interesting traditional texts, and if it's a very interesting book. It's a very unique take on Judaism, and so if the shamanic thing speaks to you in some way, I would definitely recommend that book. So that's kind of the basics of the Baal Shem Tov. We'll do like more of some of his Torah or what's kind of distinctive about him. So I'll go on to the Maggid of Mezrich in just a minute, but I can pause for other kind of comments or questions at this point about him. Okay, so the Maggid, was a little, only slightly younger than the Baal Shem Tov. He was born in 1704 and lived to 1772. And he was much more learned than, as I mentioned before, than the Baal Shem Tov in the traditional rabbinic modes of learning, certainly in Talmud, certainly in Kabbalah. And he was, before he met the Baal Shem Tov, it seems like he was more, and this actually speaks to part of what was some of the success of Hasidism, or why Hasidism was appealing, was that Kabbalah, while it was, quite popular among the rabbinic elite, the way it had been inherited in Eastern Europe primarily from the Kabbalists of Tzfat in Israel, and also, they had the Zohar as well, which comes from medieval Spain, but they thought that it was written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Israel 2,000 years previously. But a lot of that Kabbalistic tradition had a very strong ascetic quality to it, of different, a lot of fasting. There were, even different kind of penitential type things that people would do for, things like licentious thoughts or other kinds of sins and so forth. And the Baal Shem Tov was not, that was one of his changes with Hasidism, is he did not advocate an ascetic path. He wasn't big on fasting, as beyond the regular, fasts. But the Maggid seems to have been much more part of that kind of approach. And these things that he subjected himself actually made him ill, and he contracted a disease which affected his legs, and he became bedridden. And that was also, I don't know if that was also part of how he kind of became a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, because we have stories of that the Baal Shem Tov kind of did a shamanic ritual to heal him, with a staff, and calling out this text from this earlier Jewish mystical tradition from 1300 years ago. But the Maggid still continued to limp, and the Baal Shem Tov is more of an, in the spiritual types, like spiritual typologies, Baal Shem Tov is more on the ecstatic side, and some of the other Hasidim as well, like Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev. You have stories of like their excitement in prayer, and he's doing somersaults, and like he's so on fire, and that kind of thing. And the Maggid had much more of a contemplative side, but he was still a very powerful teaching. But we don't hear about visions that he had. One of the only texts that we have of the Baal Shem Tov, because he didn't actually write anything. He wrote no books. He was an exclusively oral teacher, and so we have like a letter that he wrote Gershon Kuttever when Gershon was in Israel, I think, about this soul ascent that the Baal Shem Tov did, that he met this Mashiach, Messiah-like figure, and that was clearly a very powerful experience. That was one of his soul ascents. We don't have anything like that for the Maggid that I've heard about, at least. I'm not an expert, but you know, it's not a shamanic kind of thing. What the Maggid was really amazing in doing was teaching Torah and kind of teaching deep prayer and contemplative practice. That was what attracted an incredible array of students to him. And so here's the Maggid story. And this one, what's really amazing about this story is it's not, it's actually a firsthand account. So there was a guy who was a major figure in what became the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, the kind of merging of Judaism and Western European thought in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Moses Mendelssohn being like a very prominent figure. So this guy Solomon Maimon eventually became a major figure in that. He was actually a student of Mendelssohn. But he was from Eastern Europe, and before he taught himself German and went to live in Berlin and wrote books on Kant, that Kant actually said this guy understands what I'm talking about. He visited and spent a while, I'm not sure how long, but I think it was at least a couple weeks. He visited Mezrich and stayed at the court of the Maggid, and he got kind of he was initially impressed, but then got really turned off by the Maggid, but by the kind of whole court atmosphere of like all the people who were kind of coming to see him. But he wrote an autobiography later in his life, Solomon Maimon did, and so we have this story, which is really one of the only eyewitness accounts. So he tells this story that when he was there for Shabbos, there's an amazing feast and lots of people from different regions. I guess he's in Mezrich, and eventually the Maggid comes out to join the dinner. And he's dressed all in white satin down to his shoes, and even his snuff box is white. And the meal was served mostly in silence, except punctuated by a nigun that the Maggid sang. And right, it's like Jews eating in silence, right? Isn't that kind of an amazing story in and of itself? But it did happen at least once in Jewish history. So the Maggid sings a nigun, and then he begins to kind of center himself and concentrate. And then he calls out the different names of the newcomers, the people who weren't regulars, who were visiting, and where they're from. So he says, like, Josh of Tacoma Park, and John of Laurel, and Lynn of Columbia, and all that. And then he asks each person to say a random verse from the Bible. And then he weaves a drash around these different verses that each person says. And Solomon Maimon says that, most astounding thing was that even in the part of the discourse that was related to of the drash that was related to their respective verses, we each discovered specific allusions to our private life and thoughts, and it amazed our hearts. So something like seemed to speak to each of them. So this is like an example of the kind of virtuosity, right, that was cultivated, this kind of spontaneous capacity to do something like this. And I think it's either from the Maggid or it's another Hasidic idea that people that I've heard many people quote that 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 they would once they would begin the Rebbe who was giving a drash, once he would start to hear himself talk, then he would stop and he would know that that was like, that was the end, right? As long as he was hearing like his drash coming from someplace deeper than his own head, then he would continue. And so once he started to hear himself talk, then that was the end. So so let's say I'm almost done here with the last little bit of history, and I'll give you, I'm going to share a screen with like a little bit of a map here, and then we can see if there's other just general questions about, early Hasidism and so forth. So it wasn't like there was, an organized transfer from the Baal Shem Tov to the Maggid exactly. There were other figures contemporaneous with the Baal Shem Tov who were kind of like proto-Hasidic Rebbes, like Pinchas of Koretz, some of you might have heard of him, or Yechiel Michal of Zlachov. And they kind of continued on with their disciples, but the Maggid kind of emerged and began to attract the largest circle of disciples. And he really attracted, and this is an incredible caliber of student. And those students then went on to, who were known as then the third generation. They went on to really spread Hasidism throughout into Poland and then into Russia. And so some of those are the famous people you may have heard of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who was the founder of Chabad, Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev. It's also part of, is part of the Maggid's table, as it were, like a disciple of the Maggid. Eli Melech of Legence, Reb Zusia of Hanapol, or the Meori Naim, or the Chernobyl Rebbe, who we looked at some of his stuff last week in the class, and then we'll look at he's one of my favorites, so we're going to get to some of his Torahs, I hope, in this class. And so within a generation or two after the Maggid's death in 1772, basically most of Jews in Eastern Europe were Hasidic. It was one of the most successful Jewish movements in history. And let me share my screen to give a little bit of a map. Let's see. Why isn't my... Okay, there we go. So this is from an article I found online that seems okay. It's kind of an overview of Hasidism. It seems a little bit dated, but they had some cool pictures. Like for this, for example, is the interior and exterior of the Beit HaMidrash in Mezhebuzh that the Baal Shem Tov davened in. This building there. And so here's kind of a map of the rise of Hasidism. So I can't make this larger, I don't think, very easily. But so here you can see Mezrich. So here's Mezhebuzh, right, with the Baal Shem Tov's main area. And Right, so these lines are the spread of Hasidism 1730 to 1760, right? So in the Baal Shem Tov's time, it's just kind of around in this area, and then the wider lines are as it spread from sort of after his death, in the time of the Maggid, and so Lubavitch, Chabad, kind of is up here. Schneur Zalman went up there, and here's over into Poland, which became, a major area, and Galicia, which is southern Poland, into Austria-Hungary. Italy is down here, and Vilna here, which was kind of the main center of the opposition to Hasidism. And yeah, I think gives you a little bit of a sense of the geography. Okay, it's a good place to pause to see if there's any questions or comments or reactions. One of the things that that early Hasidism is clearly about is people meeting, is that these early, what attracted so many students to these different charismatic teachers was that the students really, it wasn't their greater Torah knowledge, but it was really that they were clearly on a higher level. In Hebrew you'd say on a higher madrega in kind of Ashkenazi Hebrew, like that these teachers were really on a higher spiritual level. And think about, if anyone, I'd be curious if anyone has any from their own experience of if there are people, spiritual teachers that you've met that you were like, wow, this, sort of, I'll have what they're having or something, like that there's something about that they're clearly have it together in a certain way, or they have a certain depth of being, or of presence, or of insight, or of joy, or could be many different things that really attracted you. Any brave souls share any? Oh, great, Linda, yeah. Oh. Linda, were you going to unmute?
Sorry, I'm on an iPhone. My computer died. My very first rabbi growing up, he was Hasidic. He taught us about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. He brought in like Shlomo Carlebach in our Hebrew school. He was very spiritual, and he had a huge influence, I think, on a lot of us. And he definitely seemed to have had it together. At least, when you're someone so young, who knows, if I met him at a different time, but he was a huge influence and seemed to be on that plane that you're talking about.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Sherry.
Well, not a particular person, but I think Chabad in general, there's a certain joyful presence. And I think they're looking at interpretations are always a more positive spin, the people that I've studied with or spent time with. And even in face of tragedy, they, instead of wallowing in the sorrow, they're always looking to make good, like, well, what positive thing can we do from this? So I think just as a whole, it's a much, very positive outlook.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Great. Good, all right. So Karen, yeah.
So just kind of following up on what she was just saying, I've been to a few workshops with Hani Barron, who's the from Chabad here in Columbia, and she's just wonderful, and she's a wonderful teacher. And just like you were saying, she just kind of lifts everything up in a positive way. And she's always talking about this book, or at the time called The Ladder Up, which I've always wanted to get that book. I haven't gotten it, but it seems to be something that follows in that philosophy of always looking on the positive side and elevating the everyday to something more spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I am been influenced by Rabbi Larry Kushner. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yeah.
Rabbi Larry, I got to know when I was living up in Boston.
Oh, wow.
He had a Reformed synagogue, but what he did was he utilized a lot of the techniques of teaching with the tish around the table, with the singing, like what you did with Rabbi Josh at the beginning of this. Very effective. He gave me the impression that he kind of sensed you out. He seemed to know something about you that you were aware of, but you wondered, how did he know? And with me, it was kind of at that point in my life, I was very questioning everything. He says, well, you've come to the right place because I have a lot of questions to ask you. He put it into the reverse, and he did it constantly, and it kept people very much intrigued and involved in every one of his teachings. And he's written many books, so he's out there. You can actually read about him.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Larry Kushner, Rabbi Larry Kushner, he's still, may he live and be well. He's still alive and well, to the best of my knowledge. And he's actually an important figure in what I would call neo-Hasidism, right? That he, particularly through his writings, and I mean, he also writes about. Hasid. I didn't say this. Hasidism is basically a kind of popularization, a lot of it, of Kabbalah. So much of Hasidic Torah and the basic Hasidic, understanding and theology is Kabbalistic. It's trying to make Kabbalah more accessible. And Larry Kushner is a great example of that. And it's nice that, to have a balance with, it's great for people mentioning, regular traditional Chabad folks, but it's nice to hear from, someone who's not in that, in the traditional world, right? In many ways closer to, in our world and our kind of many of our, I would say, understandings of, the world and so forth. So thank you. Val, yeah.
Yeah, well, I have to get personal. Among my first cousins, who range from Messianic Jews to Transcendental Meditation to the Self-Realization Fellowship, and to my cousin, the Lubavitch Rebbe, who we all grew up together, and he was raised in a typical conservative congregation, went to college at Dartmouth, and then came back and started studying with the Lubavitch Rebbe, and is now, fully ordained. And he is someone who has experienced in his own personal life and with his own children some of the most horrible things. And I have to say, he has a gift of positivity. That's the best way I can put it, and infuses his life with Torah teaching. We sort of respect each other, let's put it that way. And can spar back and forth. And that ability to do so, he has a foot in both worlds, I think. But I truly have to say, I am always amazed by his ability to reflect deeply on the tragedies that have gone on in his life and turn them positively. And that's a great gift to share.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, maybe we should have him come teach at OSE or something.
Well, he would love it. He'd get on the plane in a minute.
You could even do Zoom.
That's true.
Where is he based?
Denver.
In Denver?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, great. Good. Thank you all for sharing those. Okay, well, so let's jump into our text. So you might have seen it in the when you logged on the calendar, but I just put it into the chat. And our first text. And so this class we're going to be really learning the texts directly, sort of entering the world of Hasidic text from what are called Sifrei Kodesh, holy books of Hasidic Sfarim. They're also called Hasidic books, and in translation, obviously, but I gave folks a Hebrew as well. And so this first text is one I've loved for a number of years, and it's an example of what I would call like the view, the Hasidic view, which there is no such thing officially, but in actuality there is something like that of kind of the underlying understanding of reality that informs a lot of early Hasidism, and in some other spiritual traditions like Tibetan Buddhism, for example, they talk very directly about the view, like the basic understanding of reality, and so some of their teachings are like view teachings that are oriented towards kind of acculturating or giving over like this deeper view of how reality is, and what we're doing here. I mean, in the Tibetan tradition, they're not so theological, but so I first heard this idea of like sort of Jewish view texts, Hasidic view texts from my teacher, Rabbi Miles Krasen. But I think it's a good way into the Hasidic thought, and I've found it personally really inspiring, and I hope others will find it in some way inspiring. But if the theology really doesn't speak to you, you can just take it kind of sociologically, because this kind of underlying orientation does really permeate a lot of early Hasidism, Baal Shem Tov and the Maggid and other teachers, and so the one of the core elements of what the Baal Shem Tov came to teach was that God is not Me'aver L'Yam, like beyond the sea. God, what we would in theological, the omnipresence of divinity. That divinity is completely present in all places. And as we'll see in this text, this is not an anthropomorphic sky god kind of divinity. It's very, very different, and it's basically Kabbalistic. But Kabbalah, a lot of times the text can be more complicated, and this is kind of a more like one of the reasons I like this text. It doesn't mince a lot of words for kind of taking you into the view, the Hasidic view, very quickly. So even though divinity is not apparent, God is, they even use this language of God is hidden. Like God's presence is not easily accessible to people, to the human condition. And so so they're trying to train. A huge part of this, of Hasidut is kind of training and taking on the view, both intellectually but experientially, that of the way that the divine is always present. And so I'm going to read through this text. It's a little, it needs to be unpacked a little bit as we read it, and so it doesn't lend itself so well to just having you all read individually. So I brought it. I put it that it's Baal Shem Tov, but we're not really sure. It might be Maggid. It might be another teacher, Menachem Mendel of Premishlan. It's from an early Hasidic collection called Likutim Yikarim. That is like 1792. That's a collection of early Hasidic teachings that's mostly unattributed. But this one, it appears in, some people attribute it to the Baal Shem Tov. It feels kind of Baal Shem Tov-y to me, but Baal Shem Tov or some other early Hasidic teacher. And because it's introduced in this text, I'll just say a couple word or two about the central Hasidic idea of what's called in Hebrew dveikut, which I don't know, hopefully people have maybe heard that word before. Dveikut in Hebrew means, literally it means cleaving, a deep connectedness to divinity. Devek in modern Hebrew is glued. So it's like if to be in dveikut means like you're glued to God. I think we'll talk more about it in a subsequent class, but in a way it's kind of brought up, not super directly, but it's alluded to here in this text. But this really became the central goal of Hasidism is training and fostering dveikut, deep connectedness to divinity. And what was I going to say? I lost it. So yeah, we'll jump in. And I'm going to read it a little bit slowly because it's kind of a contemplative text. Okay, so say it's the Baal Shem Tov here. It's a great advantage when a person continually contemplates in their heart that they are in the presence of the blessed Creator, Habore Yitbarach, and that divinity, that God is surrounding them on all sides. One should be so attached, and here's that word of davuk, or the same, you can hear the similarity to dveikut, so attached, so in dveikut, that one should not need to resettle oneself continually, that she or he or they is in the presence of the Blessed Holy One. Only that one should behold the Blessed Creator within one's consciousness, be'ein hasechel, with like the mind's eye, right? So he's not talking, where I'd read this is that it's not so much about the external world. It's and as he's going to say, like that realizing that God, the divinity, is the place of the world. That that divinity, it existed before the world was created, and the world exists within the Blessed Creator. But Ha'olam hu omed b'borei yitbarach. One should contemplate that the Blessed Creator is the Ein Sof. And the Ein Sof is, sorry, I should have set this up. So the Ein Sof Ein Sof means it. This is a little bit of Kabbalah here. Ein Sof means literally there is no end. Ein Sof. It's divinity completely beyond. Kabbalistically, it's completely beyond any categories. It's beyond names, but here he's kind of like, I think, using it more in the sense of like the God that he's talking about is this endless one, the Ein Sof, without end, that is encompassing all of the worlds, right? Because in Hasidic Kabbalistic worldview, this world of physicality is just one world. There's multiple worlds and levels. There's the levels of spirit beings and angels and so forth, and I'm sure many more beyond that. So that the Ein Sof, the endless one, is encompassing all of the worlds, and its divine energy, this kind of connects to what we were learning last week, but its divine energy, Shefa, flows from above to below through channels in all the worlds. And this is kind of the basic, this is a very simplified way of talking about the basic Kabbalistic understanding of the way the worlds, including our world, have divine power, divine energy, divine flow continually sustaining them, through these channels. And then, and I love this line, we are always walking within the Blessed Creator. Within the Blessed Creator. We cannot make a single movement without its Shefa, without God's Shefa, right? The divine energy and vitalizing energy, or Shefa and Chiyut. The last week was focusing particularly on Chiyut, but that's the enlivening energy of existence. Okay, so that's our first text. So let me open it up to comments, questions. What is theologically interesting, striking, new, curious. or obviously any kind of like, what is he talking about? Or, you know, or more like more specific, like what is he saying here? Yeah, Nora.
So your last sentence was the something existence of the universe, or the delight of the, I don't think it was in the text. I think it came from you.
I think there was a little the last line. "Ve'einanu yecholim lasot shum tenua below shva'o v'chiyuto." We can't make, you know, right before that. Anu holchim tamid beborech yitbarach. We're always holchim. We're walking, you know, the path of the halakha, or walking continually within the blessed Creator, and we can't make a single movement without the divine, you know, it's shefa or it's chiyut, it's vitalizing energy.
Right, yeah. So shefa and chiyut, yeah, those were the ones that kind of made me. I'm just kind of laughing because I think for so many of us in the last few years, you know, just shefa and chiyut, you know, liveliness and a sense of abundantness. I can't speak for a lot of people, but you know, I am a therapist, so I have a bit of a wide lens on this, and I'm a person in the world as well. It's been rough. It's been extra rough. Life is rough anyway, you know, and so is it that you can get that sense of dvekut when your wife is at home, yeah, raising the kids, like you said, and doing the, you know, parnasa, and like Baal Shem Tov, you know, kind of taking care of everything, and he gets to be in a meditation. And so some of it is, my comment, I guess, is a sense of how can I, you know, we can even manifest that. There's all this kind of destruction as opposed to abundance and liveliness, and connected to that kind of what are the conditions or the things that can support dvekut?
Yeah. Well,
I think there's a lot of grief about exactly this point, you know, that people can't connect to that.
yeah, I mean, there's a lot in what you said. So I guess, I mean, on a certain level, right, this is, so let's assume a world where one has, from their worldview, right, there are other people who are making significant time for spiritual practice, right? They're davening for 3 hours a day. They, you know, whether the Cossacks are chasing them, you know, or, I mean, they went through some serious shit, right, themselves. I mean, the Baal Shem Tov in particular, the Chmelnytsky massacres, I mean, they probably actually was a lot harder than what we're dealing with, but they are, you know, from the context of they have an obligation to daven, you know, to pray 3 times a day. And so at one level, right, this is a kind of like inspirational text to inform one's prayer in that kind of context, to like pray, you know, from, you know, to kind of visualize, you know, try and inhabit this text. And he's also, you know, he's very clear that it's not just about, and this is one of the wonderful things about Hasidism, is it's not just about in the context of prayer, right? And right, this is extending through the rest of one's life and one's day, you know, that you're walking within the Creator. That, you know, the divinity is with us. But I guess, you know, I mean, to our reality now, like there's no way to there's the necessity of avodah, I would say, the necessity of spiritual practice, right? That we each, in order, we're not, especially in our context, right? We're not under obligation to pray 3 times a day, but we want to be happy and joyful and feel some sense of the liveliness, the aliveness or the divine flow through our bodies, through our spirit, a sense of that spirit. And so, we each need to take on some kind of practice. So what we did last week in the Qigong class was one example. We've let's see, I think everyone, we didn't do names in the beginning because it's not a very long class, but this is my friend Naora, who's, this is the Osei community. We were in rabbinical school together many years ago, but she took a different path. So
I decided to go, I always say I decided to go a higher rung and raise a human being instead of a whole community. So
yeah, amen.
amen. You did both, Joshua, so you can multitask better than me.
Yeah.
So-
But no, I just wanted to finish my point, and then we'll go to Val. So what we've been doing in I would say in the class on some of you have been in this Making Prayer Real class that we've been doing every fourth Saturday morning. That's what this is about. I'm trying to, from my perspective, I'm trying to teach prayer in a way that is what Naora was saying, that can support the conditions of dveikut, of this sense of deep connection, of being, attached or kind of held by the divine presence. But it's something that we have to really work at, unless we're incredibly graced. But in Jewish tradition, anyone that ever acquired any level of spiritual understanding that I'm aware of, whether dead teachers or living teachers, busted their ass. I mean, they worked really hard at it. But I mean, it doesn't mean you have to spend an hour and a half every day. But that's what I mean by the necessity of avodah, of spiritual, of regular practice. So that was wonderful question. But Val and anyone else who wants to weigh in,
So I mean, my sense of the Shefa Pute is it's like a force field. It's there, it's in us, it's around us. It's there, it's, everything is out there pinging, but for it to have meaning or for it to have an effect of which we are conscious, it's like turning on the radio or turning it off. And that's where the work is. You have to be able to attract, you got to be the magnet. And the way you're a magnet in that force field is doing the work however we see that, whether it's deep contemplation and study and meditation, mindfulness, qigong, whatever. And it's probably all of those, because it really is about the conscious effort to tap into it that I think is where you begin.
Yeah. That's very well said. And it really is that we'll see how much we can get into the kind of multi entry points in this short class series. But but it is good, but it's not the same thing. Like there's different qualities. Like no one's going to tell you that your experience of a flow of chiyut is the same when you do qigong or when you're really davening is when you're really getting that kind of deep aha and that one can get in like study and insight, right? So there's, you know, there's different different qualities, different experiences, different, you know, different muscles, right, that need to be exercised, and we're all wired differently. So we'll have, you know, like Daria does really different spiritual practices than I do, right? For her to answer Nora's question, for her to feel like grounded and, you know, to feel a sense of flow and liveliness, it looks really, really different. And I'm not going to teach her practices at all. In this class, you know, I'm going to teach, you know, to the degree that we do some, I'm going to teach ones that I've liked, that, you know, that I can inhabit. But, you know, because we're not so far from the end of time, I mean, this text and certainly the one after it as well, the second view text, it is a practice in and of itself, like to you know, to take a couple minutes before prayer, right? And here, and this is why I'm a big fan of, you know, like, because this is Osei Shalom, right? So we're in synagogue, but it's really great to have a prayer practice on your own. You know, we don't have a daily. We don't do a daily minyan, and so, though actually we're on Zoom, so you could before we started davening together, if you're on Zoom, you could kind of find this text or another text and just kind of sit with that as a practice for a few minutes, and you know, help it kind of set an intention, perhaps. The second text as well that maybe we'll do next time. So there's a little bit of a practice element within these texts.
Can I just clarify? I mean, one of my questions, really quickly, one of my questions was about how to get there, but also I think how to hold both shefa, you know, but also the state of the world. Like we're not, you know, it's kind of like, you know, I kind of joke around about the Armageddon, you know, or like things are tough and the world is struggling, and I don't want to just kind of sit in meditation and just be in shefa, you know, like so how to hold both, I guess.
Yeah.
That is also part of it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, I think it's like, you know, people have to figure out their balance, and I mean, and we can take some level of inspiration from the Hasidic approach, that they were really trying to take their sense of connectedness to divinity into the world, right? And so I mean, we again, it's like for me, it's like the necessity of avodah. Like if I'm not doing some basic minimum of tending my own fire and my own, you know, internal practice, then I can't be a good father. I can't be a good rabbi. I can't be grounded. You know, we don't need a lot more. We don't need a whole bunch more ungrounded, really disconnected, angry people running around and shouting in the world right now, right? So I actually think, you know, if we could get folks to build in 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 30 minutes into their day, like it's not, you know, you think it's actually really in service. And there's ways, you know, we'll talk about this, maybe talk about this more, but I mean, the view actually of the Hasidic, what the Rebbe, the place of the Rebbe became known as the tzaddik. You know, it was kind of the Hasidic Rebbe, aka the tzaddik. You know, the guru is basically the Jewish guru, right? They really functioned in very similar ways to gurus in Indian tradition. And my teacher, Miles Crossan, years ago coined the phrase be aspiring to be a tzaddik in training, right? Like that we can all aspire and inspire to be tzaddikim in training, because, and again, in the Eastern connection, well, let me back up slightly, but because the tzaddik model is that the Rebbe, but again, this isn't just like the guru up there who does the, you know, the wondrous things that we go see, we go get the blessing from in Borough Park and so forth, right? Or we go to the Rebbe's tomb in wherever, the Lubavitcher in Queens, or I forget where they are, in Queens, I think, right? I don't want to knock that, but I don't have that. That's good, but we can take on the idea of being tzaddikim in training, because the tzaddik model, they're a channel of blessing, basically, right? That's the shefa, right? To be a person who can receive and then send out blessing. It's not a person who just receives and keeps their blessing, you know, like all, right? The whole thing is like outward directed. So the question is like, what, you know, and for me is like, well, what is the minimum of what I need to do practice wise so that I can be sufficiently outer directed, but it's a very outward oriented kind of thing, and the Kabbalistic worldview is quite activist. Like they're trying to like bring shefa, and they see the human being as having the capacity to influence the flow of shefa, right? And they couldn't do that on the political level because they were in authoritarian societies where the lord of the manor could, you know, come and take their wives or throw them in jail or whatever, you know. So they couldn't influence, you know, the larger system, but it does work in a larger direction. So I just want to make that clear that these are not like, it's not a closed off kind of view, of worldview. Any last comments, questions?
I have a hand up.
Okay. I missed your hand. Thank you.
That's all right. That's all right. First of all, your colleague, or your former colleague in class, is that Nell, did you say, or?
Nora.
Nora. Hi, okay. So it's just, I guess when I listened to Nora talk and you and someone else, I was thinking sort of a simplistic way of dealing with some of the tension that I'm hearing, of the balance, is, I guess the sense that I have perhaps from the Kabbalist was that they were so out there that they might have been oblivious to the world. They were so into that outer world that and Sof and getting there, that they were sort of in a bubble or oblivious. And you're describing the Hasidim as taking this essence and using it to be in the world, to not be oblivious to the world, that they're using it to spread that joy and make maybe other people more comfortable or relate to people. Anyhow, so that was sort of my simplistic reaction as I was hearing you
They're not.
talk. I don't know if that helps, but that they're very much in the world. They're finding these times to ground themselves, as you say, Rabbi, that you need to do in order to be in the world. We need these moments to ground ourselves, however we find to do it. And I just want to take that opportunity to thank you, because you've been trying really hard in the 4+ years you've been with us to get us to find ways to be spiritual. You tried it from a lot of different angles, and I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm taking yet another class to see what works for me.
Oh. I'm not so secretive in my methods, huh?
I know it's not a secret.
No, that's a fairly fair characterization. A lot of the Kabbalists tended to be more just limited to elite practices. That was, though they are very activist in that, in their view, they're clearing the channels, right? They're doing it on behalf of the whole system, not just even for Jews. I mean, even in the classical Kabbalistic worldview, it's not just focused at all on themselves. Like that's it. It's influencing divinity to influence, so that there can be shefa and brachot in this world.
I mean,
there was a
Tikkun Olam comes from there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and there was a kind of popularizing and democratizing of this view and of these practices among the Hasidim, that it was not. It is still there was a lot of, it took a certain level of education and to be part of this elite, to be at the, at least to be like a Rebbe, or to be really, a disciple or so forth. But there was an interest in extending spiritual practice beyond the classical Kabbalistic rabbinic avenues of prayer and Torah study. So I don't know that.
Are you talking about the Hasidims?
Yes,
or the
the
Kabbalists,
Hasidim.
or the
No,
Kabbalists?
I'm talking about the Hasidim, like the.
Okay, yeah, but the Kabbalists I thought were very superior. Like the common person could not do what they do.
Yeah, could not. Right, they were very elite. There's still a lot of scholars debate about the level of elitism that's there in Hasidism, but there's definitely less elitism than in traditional Mekubalim Kabbalists. But the point, the one of the real changes and the innovations of Hasidut was the extending of spiritual practice into other avenues of life. And so for them, that meant eating, it meant making love, it meant even, going about their day and their business. The Baal Shem Tov would talk about that it's possible to maintain dveikut even when you're talking to you know, someone about business or something like that. So there, I think, yeah, and eating was a whole kind of, you know, later Hasidism that downplayed that, but it was a real part of, you know, bringing spiritual consciousness to the act of eating. It's called in Hebrew. It's called avodah v'gashmiut, worship, spiritual practice within physicality, right? So that is an innovation of Hasidism and a difference from classical Kabbalists. Okay, well, so I do want to honor our time, and I certainly don't want you know, if folks want to stay on and ask a couple, if there's other questions or comments, but I do want to give people opportunity to hop off. So yeah, we will continue on. I'll have to. Right, you know, I wasn't quite sure what I'm going to do in the second class because I wanted to see what the first class is like. So, you know, some of the curriculum is determined significantly by you know, those who show up and what kinds of things people ask and so forth. So
Thank you.
but we'll be yeah, the next 2 weeks, same time.